Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Stephen Russell. I am the director of the School of Human Ecology at University of Texas at Austin, and I'm also chair of the Department of Human Development and Family Sciences. And I'm so excited to be part of the Texas Science Festival, welcoming you all to hear Dr. Liz Gershoff give the Amy Johnson McLaughlin Centennial Professorship Lecture. We're so excited to learn from Dr. Gershoff about her research and speaking today about coming down from the ivory tower using research to advocate on behalf of children. And this lecture is in honor and memory of Mrs. Amy Johnson McLaughlin. She was a long-time supporter and alum of UT. She was raised in Central Texas and graduated from our home economics program in 1954. Was married Mark McLaughlin, and they settled in San Angelo and raised their children there. And we're so glad that Matt McLaughlin and Brian McLaughlin are joining us today, and also her husband Mark McLaughlin is on listening today too. I regret that we can't all be in person here in Austin together to do this in person and to meet one another in person. On the other hand, more than 450 people registered for this webinar. So in a way, this gives us a much bigger reach, but it's a shame that we can't be here in person. But we're so pleased to be able to honor the memory of Amy Johnson McLaughlin in this way. She was very involved in the University of Texas and in our school, and named this professorship in her honor, and also was involved in many other projects at UT. And especially pleased that we are acknowledging Dr. Liz Gershoff's appointment as the Amy Johnson McLaughlin Centennial Professor in our department. Liz is a world leader in research on child development, is the director of our Population Research Center here at UT, and is the president of the Society for Child and Family Policy and Practice. And by the way, is an alum and did her PhD in our department, in our school, in child development here at UT Austin, and is an expert in a number of areas: parental discipline, the experience of poverty in children's lives, exposure to violence, and the ways that we can build educational environments to enrich the well-being of young children. So I'm really pleased to acknowledge, earlier today I gave Liz a commemoration of this day and of this professorship, and sorry that we can't be doing that in person, but I'm really so grateful for the McLaughlin family and the legacy that they have meant for UT, and our ability to support someone as extraordinary as Dr. Gershoff, to be able to think in this way about how we can really advocate on the behalf of children with the research that we do here at UT. So I'm really pleased to introduce Dr. Gershoff.
Well, thank you, Stephen. I appreciate that nice introduction. And welcome to all of you, and thank you for sharing your noon hour with me. And a special welcome to the McLaughlin family. I am so honored to have her name, Amy Johnson McLaughlin's name, on my professorship. I feel very honored to be able to remember her in that way. Everything I've learned about her sounds like she was a force of nature and did so much to contribute to her community and to UT and our school in particular. And so we're grateful for her legacy, and thank you all for supporting this professorship and for being here today. So I'm going to tell you a little bit today about a kind of a journey that I've gone on from being a scientist and being a researcher, and then coming to terms with the fact that I also wanted to advocate for children, and how I tried to reconcile those two desires. So what exactly is the ivory tower, and why do we call it that? So let's kind of begin there. Or I should also say that if you have questions, clarification questions as you go, please feel free to put them in the Q&A in Zoom, and Stephen will relay them to me if you are just confused about something. But if you want to have a discussion about a topic, we can save those for the end. Okay, so what exactly is the ivory tower, and why do we call it that? Well, the ivory tower term has become synonymous with university faculty, researchers pursuing truth, and doing so while they're kind of set apart from the rest of society, that we're a little bit kind of on our own and kind of, in our labs and working away. And that notion that it's an ivory tower where we happen to do that comes from some of the earliest universities. And so here's a picture of the University of Oxford. You can see they had some ivory towers there. University of Cambridge has some ivory towers. And of course, lest we forget our own ivory tower right in the middle of our campus. So many universities have kind of these symbols of reaching it up for kind of being ambitious, reaching for the sky, reaching for truth, and the towers kind of symbolize that. And so ivory tower symbolizes academic freedom. That is something that universities are founded on, that the reason why we have tenure is so that faculty can study things that might be controversial, which I'll talk to you about my research in a little bit, and also to kind of question maybe norms and beliefs and kind of push the envelope a little bit. And folks might not be willing to do that if their jobs are on the line. So having tenure, knowing that we have that system to protect us, helps faculty pursue things even when it might be inconvenient to do so. However, that fact that we have this protection has led the public to sometimes perceive academics as elitist or out of touch with the public. And we don't help matters. Oh, actually, I should say before I say that, this little star on the tower shows you where my office was. I actually had an office in this ivory tower. Years ago, the Population Research Center, which I now direct, used to be housed in the tower. We now have an office, we're housed now in the RLP building, but we used to be right there. So I did actually have to come down from the tower once in a while, physically. So academics don't really help this perception that ivory tower denizens are separate from society. We tend to publish in inaccessible journals that the public physically can't get without a subscription. We tend to use jargon that makes it inaccessible in another way because people cannot understand it. We employ complicated statistics without always explaining why and what we are doing. And so each of these things impedes the ability of the public to understand what we're doing and then to trust what we have to say. So I'm going to talk about my journey down from the ivory tower. And I should say this is a up and down, it's almost like an elevator. Sometimes I'm up being the scientist at the top of the ivory tower, and sometimes I'm down trying to do work in the community. So as a graduate student here at UT, I became interested in parents' use of physical punishment. So everything that I had been learning in graduate school was teaching me about the kinds of things that help children learn, the kinds of guidance that they need, the kinds of parenting that promote positive development. And everything I learned kind of suggested that physical punishment was not consistent with any of those things. And that made me wonder, what do we know about physical punishment? Is it actually good? I mean, people have been doing it for centuries. Why? Are they doing it because it's effective? And so I felt like we needed to know more about it. And so I conducted a review as part of my comprehensive exam. So back when I was a graduate student here, my department had a comprehensive exam. We had to write a very long paper. And so I wrote this very long paper looking at all the research and added something called a meta-analysis, which means that I took all the research that we have to date and looked at the average effect sizes, kind of how strong is the relationship between physical punishment and a variety of children's outcomes, things like aggression, social competence, things like that. So I successfully wrote that. I finished my PhD, did my dissertation on something else. But years later, I did publish a version of that paper after many, many revisions and 4 years under review. I finally got it published in 2002. And so this was the paper. And so this paper is still my most cited paper, according to Google Scholar. It's just shy of 3,000 citations so far. So it made kind of a splash when it came out. I did lots of media interviews at the time. And so people kind of understood that, the finding was that physical punishment did not promote any positive things for children. And so as a result of all the attention I got from that article, I was contacted by an advocate, Nadine Block, who was organizing a meeting in Columbus, Ohio, about how to get corporal punishment banned from public schools. And so she was organizing a group of researchers and advocates, and she thought that my research might be helpful in that regard. So I went to this meeting and met her and many other advocates who are just wonderful people and so passionate about the reason why we shouldn't be hitting kids in school with boards. And it was great meeting them. And so I learned a lot about what messages worked and the kinds of the aspects of the research that I've been doing that was helpful for them in their messaging. And so their dedication really inspired me to keep doing my part by doing good research on physical punishment, and thinking about the kinds of questions that I could help answer that would help inform policy. I should stop and say that I will sometimes use the term corporal punishment and sometimes use the term physical punishment. They both mean the same thing, hitting a child with either a hand or an object, usually on the behind as a form of discipline. In schools in the US, we typically call it corporal punishment. When we talk about parents, we usually talk about physical punishment or spanking. They all mean the same thing, but when I talk about schools, I typically say corporal punishment because for whatever reason, that's why the term we use in schools. I also have a woman named Deb Sendek up here who, Deb was a child psychologist who worked a lot on child abuse issues, both treatment and prevention. And I should say Nadine was a school psychologist. And so the two of them in their work became very passionate about this. And I am still in contact with each of them to this day, 18 years later. I emailed with Nadine on Monday, and I had a Zoom call with Deb yesterday. So I am still, we kind of formed these bonds, all trying to come at this issue from different angles, but we all share this passion for wanting to protect children from violence. So my first foray into advocacy, so I've been doing research this whole time, and then Deb and Nadine contacted me years after I met them and asked if I would write a summary of research for a lay audience in partnership with Phoenix Children's Hospital. Their team there wanted to educate parents about the harms of physical punishment and talk about methods that would be more effective for them to use. And so I knew it would take a lot of time and energy, both of which I had in short supply. I was an assistant professor at the University of Michigan at the time. I had 2 young children. I wasn't really sure if I would have time to do this and whether it made sense because I didn't have tenure yet. And so I thought about it and I thought about it, and I consulted a senior mentor at the University of Michigan for his advice. And he understood what I was saying and then my passion for it. And his advice was, be the expert, not the advocate. And so and I believe we even talked about the kind of the notion of an ivory tower. He thought that we should stay in our ivory tower and that the academics should stay in the ivory tower. We should do science kind of separate from society. And then we should let others use that information to advocate and to make changes to policy or things like that. So I thought about it and I thought about it, and I realized that just didn't sit well with me. And so this kind of little cartoon from Brookings kind of summed it up for me. A researcher saying, no, we just study it. Your job is to go out and do it. And so that's kind of what I felt like I was doing. I was doing research that was, going to stay in these journals and no one was going to do anything about it. And I didn't really want to leave it up to other people. I wanted to make sure that the research was going to be understandable and that it was my job to help translate it. So surprise, surprise, I wrote the report. And so here's a copy of the report. It came out a long time ago now. And so Phoenix Children's Hospital released it. They printed a bunch of copies. They put it on their website for many years. And it also got endorsements from several organizations, the American Academy of Pediatrics, the American Medical Association, and the American College of Emergency Physicians. And so because of this document, the advocates were able to use this and take it, they used it to educate parents, because we also made a guide for like a positive discipline guide, like a little pamphlet for parents was also available. But they could send this to Congress people, they could send it to nonprofit organizations, that they could use it as a resource. So I felt pretty good about it. You know, it's not something I'm ever going to get citations for, but I felt like I was helping contribute to translating the knowledge to the public. So I continued to do research on the impacts of physical punishment on children for over 20 years. And I continued to do so. And I did both primary empirical research, so new research studies with parents, but I also did several reviews of the research. I'm particularly proud of the title for this first one. I wasn't sure they were going to let me publish with this title, but they did. Spanking and Child Development, we know enough now to stop hitting our children. I say that because it's very important to me that people recognize they are hitting children when they are spanking them. That to me is very important, because we need to, if we're going to change this behavior, we need to acknowledge that there's violence at the heart of what we're doing. It may not be very hard, and parents may not intend to hurt their children, but there's no other way to explain that behavior of using a hand to strike somebody other than hitting. And so whenever I talk about physical punishment, spanking, corporal punishment in schools, I typically use the term hitting to kind of make that connection for people when I talk in the media and things like that. The second article here was another meta-analysis that I did with a colleague of mine, Andy Grogan-Kaler at the University of Michigan, to kind of update the meta-analysis that I'd done the first time. And so that meta-analysis provided us with another way, kind of another attempt to characterize the body of research. We looked at what we call 111 effect sizes, which is basically, again, this relationship between physical punishment or spanking and a range of child outcomes. And when we looked at them, of those 111, 79 were statistically different from 0. So that means that there's a significant relationship between spanking and things like children's ability in school, their aggression, their delinquent behavior. Of those 79, 78 were an association between spanking and something detrimental for children. And so people ask me, didn't you look for positive things? Didn't you look for the benefits of spanking? And we did. If they had been there, we would have found less aggression, we would have found less delinquent behavior, we would have seen better mental health, we would have seen better social confidence. We didn't see that. The research just doesn't show that. It shows that it's entirely detrimental for children. So I have been pretty convinced by this research over the years. I've done some other research to kind of look at quasi-experimental designs. The hallmark of science is experiments, right? We manipulate an independent variable and we look at the change in the dependent variable. And then from that, we can say the change in the independent predicted the change in the dependent. For parenting, we cannot do experiments. I cannot randomly assign parents to engage in certain kinds of behaviors. We certainly can't randomly assign parents to spank their children or not. The UT's Institutional Review Board, which reviews all studies for ethics, would not let us do a study like that. So we have to do instead something that we call quasi-experimental designs, and we use statistics to create essentially what are treatment and control or groups. So you can kind of create an independent variable. And so we use a method that comes from economics called propensity score matching. And so you take the spank group and the no spank group of children, and you match them on every characteristic you can get your hands on. So on levels of parent education, race, ethnicity, religion, region, country, beliefs about spanking, whether they were spanked themselves, kids' level of aggression, everything you can think of, you get them to be equal on everything except spanking. That's the only thing that you know of that differs between those groups. And so we say they are matched, those two groups. And then we look to see, once they're matched, do the spank and no spank groups differ on a range of outcomes? And so I've done this now 3 times in 3 different studies that are shown here. And we found that the spank group has more behavior problems, more mental health problems, and more cognitive problems in this range of studies. So again, this is as close as we can get to an experiment when we're looking at it. So we're pretty convinced that, that we can say that spanking and physical punishment do predict these changes in child behavior. So once I was convinced, I did all this basic research, how could I convince others? And that's where I get into the advocacy. So my first strategy that I thought of was trying to convince other professionals. So I, as a researcher, was convinced, but how could I convince other professionals who work with children and families who are messengers, who might be trusted as sources of advice? And a colleague of mine, Kathy Taylor at Boston College, has done a lot of research to ask parents, who do you trust for parenting advice? And it turns out that medical and mental health professionals are at the top of the list, just below your partner and your parents. So if we know that these professionals are trusted messengers, if we can get the message that physical punishment is potentially harmful to those messengers, then they can pass it along to parents. And so one of the ways we can do that is professional organizations often release what they call policy statements. So they'll make a statement about, we believe that putting children to sleep on their backs is the safest way for children to go to sleep, or something like that. They'll release some kind of policy statement. And so we realized that we could, my colleagues and I, that we could inform these organizations in releasing such statements. And so one way we tried to do that was by writing an article that was really aimed at the American Psychological Association, which I'm a member of. And now I'm president, as Stephen mentioned, of one of the divisions of APA, the American Psychological Association. And so we wrote this article to summarize the state of the causal evidence. So one of the biggest kind of criticisms of the research on physical punishment is that we can't prove that spanking or physical punishment leads to these negative outcomes because we can't do experiments. And so that's a question, since we can't do experiments, we can never definitively answer that question. But we decided we were going to review the research that gets us as close as we can. And so we wrote this article in the American Psychologist, and it developed out of a report that I wrote for a task force that two different divisions of APA had created. And so I was part of this task force, as were all of the co-authors. And so we wrote this together, hoping to kind of inform the American Psychological Association ahead of a vote on whether to have a policy statement about physical punishment. But before APA could, we were able to help the American Academy of Pediatrics to release their own statement. So in fall of 2018, they released this statement: effective discipline to raise healthy children. Bob Segi and Ben Siegel were the main authors. And I helped them over the years, kind of giving them research and advice and things like that. And so they recommend that parents do not use spanking, hitting, slapping, threatening, insulting, humiliating, or shaming. So you can see they have both the more physical punishments, but also kind of more emotionally harmful things as well. So they released this statement in the fall. And then in the spring, after that, in the spring of 2019, the American Psychological Association also voted on a similar resolution. And I was thankfully able to be there. I was representing the Division of Developmental Psychology at that meeting, so I was able to present the arguments to the council at APA that votes on these policies, and then I was able to vote for it myself. So that was a really happy day. And so APA in this statement recognizes that scientific evidence demonstrates the negative effects of physical discipline of children by caregivers, and thereby recommends that caregivers use alternative forms of discipline that are associated with more positive outcomes for children. So they're saying the research shows it's pretty strong, or strong evidence that physical punishment or physical discipline is bad, so parents should use other things. So that was pretty exciting to have these two very large organizations. I think APA has 115,000 members. I can't remember how many AAP has at this point, the American Academy of Pediatrics, but they both have tens of thousands of members. So getting this message out to their members was a pretty exciting achievement. So another strategy that I've thought about doing, my colleagues and I, is how can we convince public health officials that public health officials already see child maltreatment, child abuse prevention as a public health issue. The Centers for Disease Control have really taken that on as part of their mission. Jim Mercy at the CDC heads the violence prevention division of CDC, and he has really kind of taken on this idea that we need to make sure we're preventing violence against children as a public health issue. And so we thought that we could help include physical punishment in that if we could show that the outcomes of physical punishment are very similar to those for physical abuse. As a society, we recognize that physical abuse is harmful. Any kind of abuse of children is harmful. We want to prevent that. We have systems to do that. But what if we could show that physical punishment was having the same kinds of effects as physical abuse? Maybe that would convince people that it's a public health issue and that we should try to prevent physical punishment as well. So we did this by using a large study called the Adverse Childhood Experiences Survey. So this notion of adverse childhood experiences has really caught on in the field of public health. Hopefully most of you have heard of this notion of adverse childhood experiences. And the notion is that things that happen to you as a child, negative things, can have lasting impacts on your physical and emotional health. And there's been many studies that have shown this, but the first one was a study done in San Diego of several thousand adults. It was a recall study, so they asked the adults to recall their childhoods, and then they looked to see how those recalled events predicted their current physical health and mental health. And so it turns out that study actually asked parents about these 10 traditional ACEs, but they also asked a question about whether they'd been spanked as a child. And the data had never been analyzed. And so a couple of us approached the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, because they were now the holders of the ACEs study data, and asked if we could analyze that data. And so we did. We had to work with CDC to do that, which was a very long and arduous process that I could talk about another time. But we did. We were able to get a couple papers out of it. And so I'm kind of violating a guide about studies that are presentations. We shouldn't usually put tables up, but I'm going to just show you something quickly to make a point. This is a table from a paper that we published looking at adding spanking as an ACE. So the first 10 things you see listed there are the traditional ACEs. So different kinds of abuse and neglect, whether the mother had experienced interpersonal violence, whether anybody in the household had mental illness, whether anybody in the household had been incarcerated, whether anyone in the household had a substance abuse problem, and whether the parents had been separated or divorced. So people answered all those questions, and then they also answered whether they had been spanked as a child. And so the first thing I'm going to show you or call your attention to is these 3 kinds of abuse that, again, we as a society recognize that sexual abuse, emotional abuse, and physical abuse are harmful for children. And what we're seeing is that they are harmful into adulthood, that they lead to greater risk for drug abuse, greater risk for heavy drinking, suicide attempts, and depressed affect, which is depressive symptoms. Not for all, I mean, and this is not true for all outcomes, but you can see in generally, and particularly sexual abuse is related to all of the outcomes. But then if you add spanking into the mix, we can see that these, what we call odds ratios, so these 1.42 is an odds ratio. And the way to interpret that is that spanking makes drug use 42% more likely than if somebody had not been spanked. And then 29% more likely to have a heavy drinking problem. And then they're 39% more likely to have a suicide attempt sometime in their life. And as you can see, those numbers are somewhat similar to these ones we see for the traditionally accepted physical, sexual, and emotional abuse categories, and more so than some of the other categories that have very little impact on these adulthood outcomes. So the paper, we made the argument that spanking should be considered an ACE, and that it is a risk factor for later health problems and risk behaviors. And at the same time that we were working on that paper with the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, they were also working on this report. And our paper did not lead to this report, but their thinking informed both our paper and this report. So this report is what's called a technical package to help communities think about how to prevent child abuse and neglect. And in this report, they acknowledge that in order to prevent physical abuse of children, we may need educational and legislative interventions to reduce physical punishment as a way of preventing physical abuse. And so this is one of the first times that any government agency had made a connection between physical punishment and physical abuse. And the first time I know of that a government agency had talked about possibly having a legislative intervention, which is another word for banning physical punishment. And I'll talk more about that in a little bit. Another strategy we used to try to convince public health officials was to think about settings in public health and medical settings where physical punishment might happen and how an intervention there might be successful. And so I had heard about this intervention called no-hit zones, which was started at a children's hospital, Rainbow Children's Hospital in Cleveland, Ohio. And the idea is that medical staff were seeing parents hit their children in the hospital. Parents were frustrated, they're stressed out, and they were hitting their children. And the staff were very upset at seeing this. They didn't know what they could do. It makes other people upset to see children crying and afraid. And so Rainbow Children's did the first no-hit zone to kind of say, you know what, we're just going to we're not going to accept any hitting of anybody. Adults can't hit each other, children can't hit each other, children can't hit adults, and adults can't hit children. And so the no-hit zone kind of makes that an institutional policy so that staff don't have to be the ones to say, oh, I'm sorry, please don't do that. They can say, this is an institutional policy, I'm just implementing it. Is there a way I can help you avoid, deal with the stress of this situation? And this poster on the right is an example of one of the posters that they used and put around the hospital to educate people about the no-hit zone. And so I partnered with pediatricians at Gunderson Health System, which is a health system medical center in La Crosse, Wisconsin. They were going to implement a no-hit zone, and so they asked my colleague Kathy Taylor and I to help them evaluate their no-hit zone. And so we helped design that. We helped develop the surveys. We surveyed all of the staff. And so we have thousands of staff responses. And what we found, and we also surveyed some parents, I should say, as well, in the pediatric clinic. And what we found was that after the no-hit zone was implemented in their medical center, the staff had more negative views about corporal punishment or physical punishment. And more likely to intervene if they saw parents hitting children in the hospital. So they were emboldened to say, I now recognize that a parent spanking a child is probably not good for that child. It could scare that child, it could scare other children. And so I'm going to intervene if I see something. And they knew they had strategies. Part of the intervention was to educate staff about things they could do if they saw someone hitting their child at the hospital. The parents that we surveyed were more accepting of doctors intervening in cases of physical punishment, but they were not less likely to spank, which we actually did not expect that finding. And so we weren't surprised by that. But the fact that they understood that it was the role of the doctors to intervene, that was a positive finding. The nice thing about no-hit zones is even though they started in hospitals, just like no smoking zones also started in hospitals, no-hit zones can be implemented in a range of other settings. They can be in schools, they can be in libraries, they can be in shops, businesses. There are now no-hit zones in courtrooms, in all kinds of various places. And so it's a really exciting way and a very low-cost way to intervene and reduce physical punishment of children. And so over the years, I've given talks about no-hit zones, and this is a talk that I gave a couple of weeks ago as a webinar with the president of the American Professional Society on the Abuse of Children. She also has become very passionate about no-hit zones, and so I talked about the research on no-hit zones, and she talked about how to implement them. She's become very involved, Stacy LeBlanc, in helping people understand that this is a pretty simple thing to do. You can overcome the kind of logistical barriers that you might face. And I'll say that I've been talking with Amy Bryan about making our Priscilla Pond Flan Lab School a no-hit zone. So we're hoping to do that by the fall, which is very exciting. So another strategy is to educate professionals who work directly with parents. And so a colleague of mine and I, Shauna Lee at the University of Michigan, we gathered chapters from experts in the field who work on interventions with parents. And we put 15 different interventions in this book that clinicians and practitioners could use to implement in their own communities. And so that was published last year. A fourth strategy that I've tried to use is popular press. So just talking to the media about the research on physical punishment is a way for me to kind of come down from that ivory tower to translate the findings for the public. And so I've been doing this now for 20 years, and there still remains a lot of interest in spanking and physical punishment. And so I probably do, I used to do 1 or 2 interviews a month. Now it's probably a little bit less, but anytime a big study comes out or a law gets passed, I will get asked about it. So in these 2 examples, the first one, I was commenting on a study that evaluated the effects of entire countries banning spanking. And so there's over 60 countries now that have entirely banned physical punishment of children. And so I was commenting on that research article. On the right-hand side for this New York Times article, I was commenting on the American Academy of Pediatrics statement about physical punishment. But in other times I talk about my own research. These are just 2 examples of when I was talking about other people's work. I also do op-eds. This is an op-ed that I did at CNN a couple of years ago, and the UT communications team was really helpful in helping me craft this and get it sold to CNN as a not actually sold, but argued to CNN. And so I'm trying to help translate the research so that people understand how consistent it is, how the field of in my field, psychologists, but also pediatricians are very convinced of these findings, and that it's as close as we can get to a consensus as possible that physical punishment and spanking are harmful for children. So the final strategy I want to talk about is talking directly to policymakers. And so this is something that I wasn't really sure how to do. In graduate school, we're not trained to do this. We're trained to, again, be the people in the tower and not talk directly to policymakers. But I'm going to describe a couple efforts I've made to do this that have been pretty successful, I think. So the one I have up here on the slide, I was invited to speak at this conference in Vienna, Austria by the Austrian government to speak to what they call a high-level meeting. So when they have an international meeting that involves government officials, they usually call it a high-level meeting. And so there were government officials from dozens of countries here. It was a 2-day meeting. It was opened up by the Queen of Sweden. And then I get to speak at some point at this conference, and I got 20 minutes to do my best to pitch the research on physical punishment to this group. It was being translated to 4 languages simultaneously, like a UN meeting. It was really fascinating. And they seemed very receptive to the research. Several people came up to me after I spoke and asked questions. And then at the end of that meeting, many of these countries who hadn't already banned physical punishment signed a resolution saying they were going to act. They were going to try to move in that direction, try to get their countries to ban corporal punishment. So that was pretty exciting. A couple of years later, was asked by the Norwegian government to come speak with them. So Norway has an ombuds for children, which is an official. The one that was an ombuds when I was there, she was actually a pediatrician by training. And her job was just to make sure that all of the policies in the government were in the best interest of children, which is kind of an amazing thing that they have. And I really wish we had that in our country. We still don't have an office for children in the White House. So it's very exciting to see that Norway had this. And so they've had a ban on physical punishment for many years. And so I was kind of just there to reinforce that for them by saying, yes, there's all this research that kind of validates your decision to ban it years ago. And the Minister of Health of Norway was at that meeting. Right after that meeting, I flew to Switzerland and spoke at another international conference, also about trying to ban corporal punishment in Switzerland and in France, where it's not banned. And so there are representatives from several UN committees, including the UN Committee on the Rights of the Child, the head of Child Rights for the Council of Europe. There were senators there. There were members of the Swiss National Council. And again, it was one of these meetings where I spoke in English, but it was being translated, as you can see, into German and French simultaneously, because it was, and actually it was Italian too, I think, because Switzerland has 4 languages. And so it was again, it was an effort to try to translate the research to policymakers so that they could go back and talk to their colleagues about the need to prohibit corporal punishment. So in the United States, there's very little appetite for trying to ban physical punishment altogether. People are not interested in talking about it, for how parents use physical punishment. But there is discussion about schools' use of physical punishment. So in 19 states, it is still legal for school personnel to physically punish children as a means of discipline. And they typically use a wooden paddle that's about 2 feet long and 4 inches wide and a ½ inch thick. So I got a big wooden board, and you guys have probably all seen pictures of them. And so I was asked, I hadn't done research on corporal punishment in schools before this briefing. I was there kind of as an expert on corporal punishment generally. But this was a hearing about a bill in Congress to ban corporal punishment in schools tied to education, federal education funding. And so you can see on the very right-hand side is Deb Sendek, who I had on one of those other slides. So she was there. And then behind me is George Holden, who was a professor here at UT for many years, and was one of my mentors actually when I was in graduate school. And I saw him yesterday on a Zoom call, so I'm still in contact with him. So we got to do this briefing. Unfortunately, the bill didn't get voted on, so nothing happened at that time, but we were able to kind of bring some attention to the topic of corporal punishment in homes and schools. And so after that, I kind of got inspired to do some more research on corporal punishment in schools to understand how often is it being used. I knew that the US Department of Education had been collecting data on corporal punishment in schools, but just hadn't been publishing anything about it. And so I decided to get all the data they had and just look, where is it being used, how often, and on whom. And so my postdoc at the time, Sarah Font, and I got data from the Department of Education on all 90,000 public schools in the United States. So it's a very large, comprehensive data set. And then we looked at rates of physical punishment down to the school district level. And these are maps that Sarah created looking at the rates. And we did it looking at disparity. So we were looking at, in this case, to what extent are African-American children, Black children, being paddled more than white children? And anywhere you see orange or red on this map shows you where there's a disparity happening, where Black and African-American students are being paddled at much higher rates than their peers who are white. We did not have enough data on Latinx children to include them in this. This is just white and Black children. Now, thankfully, Texas is not looking so bad. Most of Texas, although you can see a lot of East Texas, there is still a lot of disparities by race. We then looked at gender. And so this is everything that's red or orange is boys being paddled more than girls. And you can see pretty much everywhere, boys are being paddled more than girls. And then we looked at disability status. And in this case, it's not quite as stark as gender. So the yellow is where it's pretty much equal or less than non-disabled. But there are still many school districts where disabled children are being paddled at higher rates than non-disabled children. That finding in particular resonated with policymakers, and they became pretty upset about the idea of disabled children being hit in school, which I'm glad of. I'm glad that they were. I wish they were also upset about any children being hit in school. But in this case, several states were upset about the disability issue. And so, I guess I'm going to take a little tangent before I talk about the disability issue. Once Sarah and I wrote this report, we worked with the Society for Research in Child Development, which published the report. to go have a visit at the Office for Civil Rights at the Department of Education. And I should also say that Stephen Russell had a friend working there. And so he also helped make the introduction. So we were able to meet with the staff there and present what we found. And they were pretty upset by those findings. And so they went back to their boss, the Secretary of Education, and they worked on a policy. In the meantime, I helped an organization called the National Women's Law Center write this kind of letter opposing corporal punishment in schools. Down here, you can see that they cited our report, and we got 74 organizations to sign on, including several education-based organizations. And as a result of that, the Secretary of Education at the time, who was John King Jr., this was Obama's second Secretary of Education, he released this letter to governors and chief state school officers saying, you really need to stop physical punishment in your schools. You really need to stop this practice. And so that was pretty exciting to have the head of all education in the country say, you know, this is probably a bad thing. Now, the federal government does not have control over what states do and their discipline. And actually, states can make it legal or not. And then it's really up to school districts, and even at the school level, principals can decide whether or not they want to use certain kinds of discipline if it's legal in the state. But this was an important way to make a consistent message across the country. And so after that statement by the secretary, after our reports about disabilities, 3 states passed laws banning physical punishment for disabled children. So that was good. Again, we're very excited about that. I just wish they had gone a little farther, but Louisiana, Oklahoma, and Tennessee, they all decided to ban physical punishment of children with disabilities. Noticeably, Texas did nothing about that. So I want to end by just talking about a few other things that I'm doing related to using research to inform advocacy and policy change. I have an article that was just accepted by the Lancet with these colleagues that are listed here. And so we were actually asked to do, well, the first few authors were asked to do this article, and then they brought me on. The Lancet is interested in research that informs policy, which is something I didn't know until then. And so the Lancet, as you can see, is a very highly cited, has a high impact factor. And so these are colleagues of mine from England, Canada, and Ireland. And actually, Gillian Van Turnhout is a former senator who wrote the law in Ireland banning physical punishment of children, and she got that law passed. And so it's, it's this mix of researchers and policymakers. And we did a narrative summary of the research on physical punishment. And what I have here in purple is our very last paragraph. Because they wanted us to make policy statement, we say at the very end, given the high prevalence of physical punishment around the world, there's no time to waste. All countries should heed the UN's call to uphold children's human rights and promote their well-being by prohibiting physical punishment in all forms and all settings. So it was kind of liberating to have a journal actually allow us to say something like that. Most journals don't allow you to kind of make those policy connections, but they really wanted us to be explicit about that. So that article is coming out any day. We don't know exactly when. We think the Lancet is going to do a big media push on it. So I might be busy doing that for a while. We expect it to have more play internationally than in the US because of the children's rights issue it's a stronger argument in other countries than the US, unfortunately. On April 30th, I'm going to be, again, summarizing research to a high-level international meeting that's being convened by an organization called End Violence Against Children, along with these other partners. You can see the UN and the World Health Organization are involved. They want to, it's a 2-day meeting. The day that I'm going to speak about is about why countries need bans. The second day is going to be about how to implement them. And then finally, something I'm doing is there's another opportunity to end corporal punishment in schools in the US. So Representative McEachin from Virginia and Senator Murphy from Connecticut are they're writing 2 bills, one in the House, one in the Senate, to ban corporal punishment from schools. And so that if schools and states want education funding from the federal government, they have to ban physical punishment. And they introduced this bill in the fall. So the copy I have here is from the one in the fall. They're working on rewriting it, and they're supposed to reintroduce it in the next couple of days. I've been in pretty regular contact with the staff from each of their offices. And I'm also helping create a congressional briefing to educate staff and members about the research on physical punishment and why bans would be necessary. I'm doing that as part of my role as president of the Society for Child and Family Practice. I'm leading an interdisciplinary or interdivision group among the American Psychological Association on that. And then for the briefing, we're working with Education Trust, the president of whom is actually John King, the former Secretary of Education. And then we're also working with the Southern Poverty Law Center to create that briefing. And so when we talked yesterday, we're still not sure exactly when the bill is going to be introduced. We want to have the hearing right after it, or the briefing, sorry. The hearing is what happens in Congress. And so it should be, we think it might happen during April, actually, which is Child Abuse Prevention Month. So it would be nice to have it happen in April. So just to conclude, I'm driven to do this kind of advocacy because I'm so convinced by the research that I've done over the years. I mean, I didn't do the advocacy until I was really convinced by how strong it was, showing that physical punishment is harmful for children. I've been really humbled by the reception my research has received, both in this country and around the world. And, knowing that it's affecting policy. I mean, my research has been used in multiple countries, legislatures, when they're talking about whether to ban, they often refer to my research. And so that's very humbling. And I feel like if I could just, help one parent decide not to spank and hit their child, I feel like it will all have been worth it. If we could help more children grow up with, without violence, I think that our world would be a much better place. And that's all I have for you today. If you want to go ahead and write down my email address, if you have questions for me, feel free to send them along. But I will stop sharing so that I can answer some questions.
Well, they've been great. Thank you so much, Liz. And your work is so important, and it's so great to have a moment for you to really reflect on it and share with us the big picture of your impact, around the world. And it's so exciting. And there have been some really great questions. And we don't have much time, so I'm just going to dive in. Actually, Lori McLaughlin, we're glad you're here too. Amy Johnson McLaughlin's daughter asked this really important one. What are the most effective alternatives? Like, what do you tell parents or institutions, schools, hospitals? What's your best advice?
That's a hard question because there's not one thing that works in all situations. But the best thing we can do is motivate children to behave in ways that we would like them to behave. And so helping them be in a situation where they can make a positive choice. And so one of the best ways we can do that is by giving them positive attention when they do things that we like. And so, I really like how you share that toy with your brother. I really appreciate you helping. Giving attention for the positive things is going to make those positive things more likely. If you give less attention to the negative things, those will slowly start to fade out because they're not being reinforced. If you reinforce the positive things, you're going to see those a lot more. And so it's all about helping children make positive choices and understanding that they have, and this is, not 1-year-olds I'm talking a little bit older, but, hitting a child doesn't help them learn anything. All it helps them learn is that the parent, anyone who's bigger and stronger than you, can hurt you. What we want them to learn is why was their behavior not great and what would we like them to do instead? And so the more we can tell them what we expect them to do and show them with our own behavior what we expect, those are ways that we're going to increase that kind of positive behavior. So we want to think more about, if for discipline, we should be thinking more about promoting the positive rather than kind of punishing the negative. If we thought more like that, I think that parents would have a better chance of kind of increasing the positive behaviors that kids engage in.
That's great. One person asked about how and whether we're training graduate students to be able to use advocacy in this kind of way. Yeah.
That is an interesting question. I'm trying to think if I do. I mean, I teach a class on children and public policy for undergraduates, And so I talk with them a lot about how we as citizens, not just as researchers, but as citizens, how we can advocate for policies that we believe in. And I do talk about the role of research. I think for graduate students, I think I do talk about it in, we teach a class in our department on the context of development, and I spend some time talking about policy. But yeah, I mean, maybe Stephen, we should do this in our seminar for graduate students. I'd be happy to do a little workshop for folks on how to do this.
Right. Well, and actually a very recent question that I think gets at this, like, what can a high school student do to get involved? Such a great question.
Yeah, I mean, part of how my passion for helping children began was as a volunteer. I did lots of volunteer work related to education, related to child abuse prevention. And I think high school students can definitely get involved in volunteer work in a lot of agencies. As a high school student, you can even volunteer to be to work in the legislature, to work in a legislator's office. If you really want to learn about policy, you can work as a page, both here in Austin. You can do it in DC. And so that's a really great way to see the inner workings of policy. I wish I had done that to kind of see how the real sausage making happens.
Yeah.
But I mean, those are the two things I think I would encourage for high school students.
So I think this thing is actually going to end whether we like it or not right at 1 o'clock. So I'm going to combine this a couple questions, and it's kind of looking back, looking forward. A couple questions about what was your motivation to start this work in the first place, and then another question about how has being involved in advocacy changed your work, and what is your next thing? What's next? You've spoken to that a little bit, but what's next on your research agenda?
So I began interested in this when I was actually an undergraduate at the University of Virginia. I was doing a research project where I listened to audio tapes of parents talking about discipline. And it was really kind of shocking to me how many parents were talking about using very extreme physical punishment that my family didn't use and none of my friends used. But I mean, they were asked, like, what would you do if your child was touching a hot stove or near a hot stove? And they said, well, I would put their hand on the stove and like basically burn it. And I was just like, what? I mean, it was just horrible things. And I just thought, but these parents are saying it very, very sincerely. They really think that they're helping their children. And so it made me think there's just a disconnect between what we know about children and what we've been thinking for years. Yeah. And so that's kind of what motivated me, is try to understand, what does the research actually show about whether this is effective and good for kids or not? And so going forward, I mean, I think I'm just still trying to answer questions that will help people understand, whether physical punishment is harmful across different cultural groups, against different countries. I've started a project now looking at low and middle income countries to see if the research applies to those countries as well. So I think just trying to help answer those kinds of final questions, more about this kind of causal issue, is very interesting to me. So doing more work on that, I think, will help inform people.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much. And thanks so much. Members of the McLaughlin family were here today.
Yes, thank you.
We can't thank you all enough for helping us do this kind of work that is both advancing science and really changing the stakes for children. So, and we're so proud and honored to have you here at UT, Liz. And thanks so much, everyone, for being here.
Thanks, everybody.